to go ahead and get started?
You're live.
We're live? Okay. This is the Common Council Quality of Life and Infrastructure Committee, March 28th, 2022. Do a quick roll call here. Councilmember Risberger, I'm here. Councilmember Davies?
Here.
Councilmember Harrington?
Yes.
Okay.
Or here, sorry.
And we have our city administrator here also. Okay. All right, so did everybody have a chance to look at the minutes from the February meeting?
Yes.
Any questions at all?
No.
All right, I think I'm going to jump around on our topics here because they're not in, to try to make it expedite the conversation here. I'm going to start out with the housing studies review. This was originally it was listed as a list of recommendations from the Housing Commission in an email through Danny Lappin, and then we were going to reach back out to them to see if they had changed their recommendations when the chair position changed to Ed May. So I got a sort of a message from Ed May a couple weeks ago, and I didn't quite understand the reply, so I called them yesterday and asked them, so what are you doing with this list of recommendations? And what he told me is they're completely redoing it, because I don't know if you guys read through that sheet of the draft. They weren't really recommendations. It was just a draft review of the various housing studies, but even then it felt like there was a lot missing from it. Well, it wasn't organized as well as it could be. So they're going to go through, they're going to be breaking up into subcommittees and having further discussions and then getting back to us at some point down the road. So for right now, I think we can put this on the back burner until we get some more information.
Yeah, any timeline on that? I mean, obviously, this is an important issue, so I just want to make sure we don't let it sit too long.
Well, I look at it as it's not a new issue. We've been discussing it off and on for the last 10 years.
Right.
We just have a housing commission, like a permanent housing commission now. So I think Ed realizes just as well as everybody else that it's, this is a big, big, big issue here in Oneonta. So they want to do it right, and I think his plan, the way Ed is and the way he works, I think his plan is the way to go forward. So I'm hoping within the next few months we get some more information, something finalized.
Well, I mean, another way of looking at it also is that if they bring to have recommendations, which really have to be bringing forward, even if it's in drips and drabs, because I don't think this is a one and done recommendation. There's going to be a lot of work that needs to go down. So I would really like to see if everything finalized. And I recognize that I don't want to push the committee quicker than we need to be, but just to try to create opportunity to take with the recommendations and figure out how we can operationalize them, or grants we might need to pursue, whatever else it might need. There's going to be a lot of work that needs to be done.
Well, Ed is more than willing to come here and speak with us. Do you want me to ask him to come and give us an update on what they're doing in the next month's meeting? Would that help?
I don't want to push on it either. That's as a member of the commission, that's a lot of time already spent doing something. So I'm just really trying to get things moving along as much as we can. So
Okay.
maybe that's something that, Scott, I think you would sit on that committee, we can bring it back to them. That anything that, even if they have it, one particular idea, I don't think it needs to be part of a massive report that they can then bring back to us. That's my only recommendation.
Yeah, if there's something solidified.
Yeah, exactly. Right. There's going to be a lot of recommendations made over hopefully the course of a long time, until we disband the housing commission, because everything's perfect, but I don't know that that will take place in the next couple of years.
Okay.
We'll just jump in if you don't mind.
Sure.
I know that some of our staff, Judy and Stephen, myself a little bit, spent quite a bit of time working with Danny and I think a couple others from the commission, updating what they wanted to do with that spreadsheet. I don't know if it was intended to be solid recommendations. I think eventually it was going to develop into that, but I think that was the first draft of just having reviewed where we're at now, what has been done based on these previous housing studies, we did several of them. That spreadsheet, you can jump in Judy or Steve if you'd like, but that was kind of a compilation of what those previous studies had yielded, and do we want to keep those as our priorities, or are there some things that are no longer applicable, which I think we've identified some of those, and sort of as a first step. So I would hate to see the housing commission just dismiss that as, and try to reinvent the wheel. I don't know what their intent is, but just from my perspective.
It might be a good idea to reach out to them before their next meeting and then attend the next meeting and see what their plan is with this, and make sure that they're aware of that. When I looked at that, it didn't seem like there were any recommendations in there to me. It just seemed to be a light draft review of what's been done in the past. And I mean, it identified the problems, but we all knew the problems. I mean, the problems were identified 10 years ago. That really hasn't changed. So I guess, and maybe it's just me, since I've seen this so many times, it didn't seem like any new information to me.
Right. Go ahead, Judy.
Yeah, Audrey Benkenstein put the original Excel file together. It was basically going through our existing housing studies and gleaning out of them recommendations that were in those studies, and then coming to city staff with that complete list. We went through it, we had a couple meetings on it, went through the whole list, and determined what the status of each of those recommendations were. So that's being used as a starting point for the Housing Commission to determine where we're at with what was looked at in prior studies. And then we had a change in the chairmanship, and so Ed May is just now getting back started. I'm not sure what he's going to be doing with that exactly. I don't even think he's discussed it at a meeting since he became chairman. So I think that'll be, I'm assuming that's going to be part of his next steps. That was supposed to just be a tool for them to get started, to determine what has been looked at in the past, where we're at with those items, and select their priorities based on that and new information that they're getting and what their priorities are, which right now my understanding is one of the main priorities is going to be for market rate housing. Another thing that the committee is working on is drafting a fair housing plan.
Yeah, they had to go back, Dave, and redo, the meeting that we had after Ed got elected was 45 minutes of it was presentation on the refugees and how Utica does it. So there wasn't a lot of talk in the last 15 minutes of where they were going to go, other than reread the charge, look at everything that's in front of them, and Mayor Drenick also was there and was trying to push the committee more towards market rate. Look at all the other issues, but what do we need for market rate housing is basically what his thing was.
All right. So going forward with this, I mean, what would you guys like to do at this point? I mean,
I think let's give the committee a little bit of space to work, see where they're going to go, what direction they're going to go, what they're going to reach out, what they're going to need from Greg and Judy and Steve. And I mean, we got to also remember we just appointed Steve too, so there's a little bit slower probably than what we want to go at a pace, but we don't want to rush it and go down the wrong rabbit hole either. So.
well, it's also a problem that's not an easy problem to solve. I mean, I used to describe it as trying to get your arms around an octopus. Okay, all right. Moving forward, unless anybody has anything else they want to add on that topic. This was brought to me at the Planning Commission about some concerns about the Church and Walnut Street, that intersection, and possibly turning it into a three-way stop. Did you want to, if you want to speak to
Yeah,
this,
let's,
I'd just ask you to stand up, give your name, where you live,
You go
and,
first, Mark.
I have to stand up, okay.
well, you don't have to stand up. Sorry, I'm used to, council meetings where maybe you stand up.
It's uncomfortable. Yeah, I live on Church Street. I live on 15 Church Street, and,
Your
when
name
we
is?
get- The what?
Your
Oh,
name?
I'm Bonnie Stanton,
Okay.
yeah. And, we also wanted one on, what's that, Franklin?
And
And
you tell them what
church.
you want first.
Another stop sign. We were thinking 2 stop signs. The more the better on that street, because it's become crazy on Church Street with the traffic. And it's just a main throughway, because there's no stop signs on Church Street at all. And it's become dangerous. We have the park right next door. There's kids in the neighborhood. I've lost a dog. There's
There's a cat.
2 cats, actually. My little sister's handicapped. There's a toddler across the street, and it's just nonstop. And the other day I was following somebody just to see what it was like, just to drive at their pace, because they seemed like they were going a little fast, and they were only doing 30. They weren't speeding, and it was crazy for a residential neighborhood. They weren't even breaking any laws. So I know that putting up stop signs or speed limits wouldn't change anything. They'll still just go faster. And
Is it 30 or 25 in the city?
30 must,
30.
I suppose there's some areas that are 25, but not.
yeah,
Okay.
because I've talked to the police about it, and they're like, they're not actually speeding, and they actually aren't, but it sure seems like it. And they come flying around the turn. Franklin is kind of a blind turn, so by the time they get right over to our houses,
Yeah,
and they're
you got
just
to
heading
turn.
to the red light up ahead, trying to catch the green, and they're just stepping on it. So,
Okay, speak.
Go ahead. Yep.
I'm Bob Stanton. I live with Bonnie. She lives downstairs, upstairs I live. There, Church Street is a long straightaway, and most people do 30. There are quite a few, now and then, that do 35, maybe 40. As she said, we've lost 2 animals. And last summer, the car crashed into the telephone pole in front of my house, broke the telephone pole in half, landed on my front lawn. And I'm not asking that they lower the speed limit. I just want to slow the cars down a little bit. They're tempted. They start out at Center Street, and by the time they get in front of our house, they're going pretty fast.
They're going.
Some of them, yeah. So when I lived up in Fayetteville, we had a similar situation, and the city put in 3-way stops on the three team streets. And I asked why they did that, because it was inconvenient. And they said, well, it slows the traffic down. People stop at the street and then they can't get going more than 25 miles an hour before they hit the next stop street. So I was thinking one on Walnut and Church, one on Franklin and Church. They get down, it slows them down. They're gonna go rolling through the stop about 5 miles an hour if there's no police looking, and then they'll go on. So that would be a way of slowing the traffic down without inconveniencing anybody. I figure it'll take them an extra 30 seconds or 1 minute to make the trip from Church Street to Chestnut Street. But that would make our life a lot better.
yeah, and I've talked to the neighbors around there, and they're all concerned. Our neighbor next door has called the mayor, and seemed like it got anywhere, told to talk to this person and that person, and just seems to get dropped. But it's a
Do you
really
feel this
true.
is a new problem recently, or is this a problem that's always been there, or?
Always been there.
It's kind of always been there. It seems like the traffic's gotten heavy over the last few years, but, that's just Oneonta, I guess. I know there's no stop signs, there's no stop signs on West Street. Is that the other
West
one?
Street, yeah.
West Street and Church Street, but other than that, every other street has stop signs or red lights or something. And they don't have problems like we do. So, it's
Seems like
just
a lot of
everybody's
people-
main drag, it's just become a highway. So,
Okay, I think we're gonna have a discussion here and discuss with DPW and our city administrator, and let's see what we can do. It seems to me like a lot of the north-south streets don't necessarily have stop signs, for various reasons, but I know that years ago with E Street had all the different stoplights, and we took the stoplights out and changed them over to stop signs, because the thought was that people would go to the stoplight, stop, and then it would turn green, and they'd gun the engine and take off, and they thought that putting stop signs would slow people down. It doesn't necessarily slow people down, it slows them down temporarily.
Mhm.
So,
That's something.
yeah, but we also don't want to just throw signs up everywhere without knowing, like, being strategic about it too. So, so for right now, I'm gonna open it up to you guys. What are your thoughts?
I'd immediately want to turn to Greg and give his thoughts. And also, Greg, I know you've talked over the years about a number of different traffic calming measures. Your knowledge of this area of Church Street, is there something that we could utilize that would would stop signs do the trick? And what could we do to be able to address this?
I mean, generally speaking, and I would agree that there isn't a high level of speeding or a high incidence of speeding. We did a speed study, I think it was the neighbor, because it wasn't you guys, it was, I forget her name, that contacted Mayor Herzig. I think it was July.
I contacted him once.
Summer, last summer.
Yeah.
We did a speed study there, the police did, and there was like 3% speeding, maybe lower than that. I think the median speed, 85th percentile, which is kind of how you set speed limits generally speaking, was around 28 miles an hour. So it's not a speed issue, but a perception issue as far as
They're not
the
careful.
speed near animals, people, whatever.
Yeah.
So I don't, generally speaking, stop signs aren't used as speed control. They're not a good measure for that. They can sometimes create other issues. When you encounter a stop sign that maybe you wouldn't expect to be there. I mean, Church Street has a high volume of traffic compared to any of the side streets, certainly High Street, Franklin, even Walnut. So it's not like a natural, you don't really anticipate there being a stop on what is the major street. And sometimes that can cause issues. I think, Chris and I were talking about this before, and just anecdotally speaking, if you think of Spruce Street, there are some, and even Center Street, there's some stop signs at certain intersections, and then that intersection doesn't have one. It doesn't really, there's no rhyme or reason to it necessarily, and I've noticed that, why was that done that way? And I feel like sometimes too many stop signs can be a bad thing. So I wouldn't necessarily jump to putting stop signs in. I would be very hesitant to do that. I wouldn't want to do that or recommend it without a real study. As far as other traffic calming measures, generally speaking, curb bump outs, street trees, things that make the road feel narrower, whether or not it actually is narrower, tends to slow traffic down. There aren't a ton of trees on Church Street. I think there's some younger ones. The medians aren't very wide there. But maybe that's something that could be changed in a future street construction project. Obviously, that's an expensive thing, but generally speaking, when you think of a highway versus a city street, why does it feel more comfortable to drive fast on a highway? Because it's big and it's open, where if you feel constricted, it naturally tends to slow traffic.
There's a lot of cars parked on the
Yeah.
street, so.
Yeah, parked cars actually can help in that regard too.
Yeah,
You feel-
yeah, but I know that, putting bump outs would take away parking spots, which would probably be another issue, so.
Let me say this. You're right about that inconvenience and everything. But there is one place where you could use a stop sign, and that's where Walnut Street tees into Church Street. There's a lot of traffic there, and you come up on Walnut Street, and you gotta wait until these people go by. Somebody might, there were big bushes there a couple of years ago. You could hardly see around them. And I think that would be a little bit of maybe one stop sign on Walnut and Church, just to make it more convenient for people to pull out.
I don't think that would help us, though. I think that the Franklin one would be an issue for us personally, because it's a turn, and it's kind of a blind turn when they're coming. Not so much going, it's they're coming, and then they just are gunning it by the time they get around that turn. and they're not looking, so. And there are lots of cars and things that you would think would slow people down, they're just careless, it's, just seems like if they stopped, they'd have to pause for a second to think, and at least look for cars. So if they're looking for cars, they may be noticing other things that are going on, so.
When we look to put a new stop sign in, do we look at only speed or do we look at volume? Is there a volume level that is then recommended?
I can't speak, we certainly look at both, we look at all the characteristics, geometry, the intersection. I think Franklin, when you mentioned Franklin, that the concern that comes to mind is the sight distance around the corner, like you mentioned. If you're going around the corner and now there's a stop car in front of you, a stop sign, is that gonna increase the number of rear endings? I mean, it's something we want to look at. But certainly volume, like I was saying, Church Street being a throughway, not a lot of, maybe more so at Walnut, and that's maybe something we can look at. But if there's a much higher volume on the main street as opposed to side street, you would typically put stop signs on the main road. But that is something we would look at.
Neighbor
we did look-
suggested, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Another suggestion we heard was to make it into a one-way, and I said, I'll never do that, but, yeah.
I think I'm actually not gonna say no to everything, and I don't need to say no. Discussing one ways in general, a lot of times you get faster traffic, because now
Really?
there's not that, there's no conflict there, it's,
Especially considering it's a two-way now, turn a two-way into a one-way, it'd be
yeah.
super highway.
That wouldn't be good for us if it was a one-way.
Yeah, it was just a suggestion, something, I want something.
I mean, the other thing you have on Church Street is it's probably one of our more dense residential neighborhoods as far as number of units per like frontage. So Church Street and those other connector streets all are very, you have like 9-unit apartment buildings on that street. So I mean, you're generating a lot of traffic from those high density residences.
Well, maybe.
And that's what's feeding your traffic.
Obviously, when that road was put in and the houses were built there, the density of population was significantly less. I think it's safe to make that assumption. Maybe we need to reevaluate looking at the density of population there and subsequent number of cars. Maybe we need to reevaluate it being a main thoroughfare, and maybe we do want to break it up with stop signs.
Could you just reduce the overall speed?
I think we'd never follow the rule.
We're limited to what we can do. I think the most we can do is 25.
You change it to 25, but again, it's more about the physical characteristics of the street that determines the actual speed average. And right now, it's the 85th percentile, so that 85th fastest car out of 100 is going 28 miles an hour in one direction. I think it was 25 in the other direction. So it's not as though there's a natural speeding problem there. I think reducing to 25, you probably have about the same, maybe a little bit lower, because some people see 25 and actually want to comply. But I think more than a desire to comply with the speed limit, it's the physical characteristics of the street that determine the speed that's moving on the street. I don't know, Chris.
Looking at the data, I remember that there was a higher number going one way versus another other way. Wasn't it 5,800 cars during that time period going one way? Was it 8,000 the other way? It was it was a significant difference
Because the speed
from one way to the other way.
Over the course of every how many days, or it was a full week, and there are more cars going one direction than the other
Yeah.
for whatever reason, and I forget which
Probably
direction.
going to the college.
Probably going in that
Yeah.
direction,
Yeah.
going down West Street.
Yeah,
That would make sense.
I would almost guarantee that.
So they're cutting off the corner instead of going up Chestnut,
Yeah.
going up Church.
Or then you can cut it over Cherry to West and keep on going, right?
So, I'm just
Go
gonna,
straight up to center and
Go ahead, Scott.
I think we just need to do some more, let's look at it, and let's give it its due diligence, let's really look at it. I'm gonna fall back a little bit on my experience in enforcement and stop signs. A lot of times when you put stop signs in, we ended up in neighborhoods having to sit there in the patrol car writing tickets because they used it as a speedway. That's a challenge to them. How fast can I get going to the next stop sign and slam on the brakes to see if I can stop in time? And, So, I mean, it's where you think a stop sign might work. Sometimes it causes more congestion, it actually causes accidents. So I think it's really look at it, overall, take everything into account and then try to make the best thing that we can.
What about a yield? Is that just to throw out an option?
Well, the same thing, because you're almost
Yeah.
turning into a stop sign,
Right.
and, you know, it's,
Yeah.
it's not gonna be solved easily,
No.
to be honest with you.
Mark, you want?
Okay, just one more question for you, Greg. Are there any paint options that might influence the
I think
situation?
certainly freshening up, I believe there's a paint crosswalk now, across Church at Walnut.
I don't
Or
think
was
there's
it
any
not?
paint on the street right now at all.
We've had some issues the last few years, getting all that work done with contractors, but we're gonna catch up this year, so.
We're actually
refreshing
working on a
those.
bid right now to put out a striping contract, so, and we're not gonna, we're gonna object to hiring the one that we had the last 3 years, so.
But is there anything beyond even just striking the crosswalk that helps? I'm just trying to think
Well,
about
okay, so when I talk about traffic calming and curb bump out, so right now, is we've changed the signage, you probably noticed last summer to have parking on one side of the street every day of the week, it used to be the alternate side. The reason for that was in anticipation of the West Street project, which was going to start last summer, now it's starting now, to keep all the cars on one side, so that Monday, Tuesday switch over, there's gonna be a lot more detour traffic, we didn't want there to be more conflicts there. But if you had parking on one side all the time, then you could do a bump out, or you could do a bump out with a line and have an edge line drawn. It tries to just guide people, and you could we could put a double yellow center line at that point too, and try to just artificially, visually narrow the street. That can have some effect. I'm not sure how much of an effect it would have. That's something we could
Just
look
looking,
at.
I mean, I'm with Scott, I think we need to explore the option, you said the same thing, Dave, just trying to look at what would be the easy options that we might be able to enact immediately versus what are the ones that we might have to have before we
I'm all for trees. If you want
Can you
planting
come,
trees around there would be fantastic, but in the median, it stretched me out.
I mean, I
If
don't know
that's an option.
what the width of Church Street is now overall. You know, typically a minimum travel lane is 10 foot wide, and a parking lane 7 foot wide. So if you had 20, if the street's 30 feet wide and we have 27, that's something we've done some other places where when we do a project, we put the curb in and make the street a little bit narrower, so there's a bigger median to put bigger trees. Because I know those medians are huge now.
No.
Big.
Yeah, like
And
potatoes.
there's not much of a curb.
well, what I would recommend, I mean, obviously, there's not much we can do at the moment, because we have the West Street shut down for right now.
Mhm.
That's gonna take a while. Can you come up with a couple easy solutions that we can at least try that are not expensive, something that we could absolutely try, as soon as the West Street is reconstructed and we have the traffic back to normal? Something along the lines of the painting the lines. I'd rather try something easy first and cheap first before we go to a big project and see if this works and at least try it alleviates it a little bit.
Are the cars gonna continue to be parked on the other side? Or is that gonna be an ongoing thing, or is that a temporary thing where they're?
It was intended to be temporary for construction, but I think we're kind of using this period as an evaluation to see whether we're gonna keep that. Obviously, the reason for the alternate side is for street cleaning, to be able to get in there and also to move the cars, but, maybe this case is one where we wanna keep them on one side.
Okay.
You can't paint a center line if the center of the road moves every day, or once
Uh-huh.
a week right now with the alternate side.
Right.
Have you noticed a difference from?
You mean as far as
Yeah.
traffic?
Yeah.
Not really, no. I mean, it's heavier right now, especially right now, but it's,
There's one last thing I just thought of it. It's only 3% of the people that are speeding, but they're a real problem.
Well, 30 is too fast. It seems like they're speeding, but if you actually go out and you drive behind them, they're not actually speeding. You're just measuring.
3%.
Right, but they're not really the big issue. I mean, there's a lot of issues besides that. 30 feels like 90 on Church Street.
Okay, so we'll look at low-cost options to start with, and then go, see if that works. If it doesn't, we'll go from there.
And stop signs aren't too expensive.
True, but I don't want to jump into that unless that's something that you recommend, and that that's a solution to go with.
Even just the one.
But I don't know that I would recommend, my own opinion, I don't know that I would recommend putting one on Franklin because of the turn. And if somebody is stopped there, I just don't have traffic going really fast down, or, well, 30 down Church Street, and they come around the corner, and you don't see anybody around the corner, you're gonna end up having a fender bender eventually.
Yeah.
But let's see what Greg comes up with, and we'll go from there.
Well, it's that blind turn that I'm worried they're coming around really fast, they're gonna hit somebody.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, there's,
I'd much rather they hit a car than one of the kids, so,
well, let's see what Greg comes up with.
okay.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming in and letting us,
Thank you.
voicing your concerns about this.
Okay, thanks for
Otherwise,
having me.
we wouldn't know.
Have a good day.
Okay, community gardens expansion, where did we leave off with this, or had we just started it?
I don't think we're going to do that.
Wasn't that the one we put on hold and carried over? I can hear you. So I don't think we started it at all.
Okay, all right, so this was, we were looking, actually, I think you brought this up to me, right? Because the thought was to try to find another location where we could have a second community garden. Yeah. From what I remember, the biggest issue is having a water source nearby, and it kind of limits our options. So, have you guys thought about this? Have you thought about this as the environmental board?
Yes, so here's the degree to which they thought about it. This was originally put into the 2030 sustainability report, the idea
Right.
that we try to have a community garden in every ward to be able to, for many different reasons. That's about as far as that conversation went. You know, I think that we have, obviously we're limited to what we have, right, city property, and that's kind of limited. Clearly, we have the parks as options, some of the smaller parks as options, like the one at the top of Maple Street, so that's about as far as we've gone, looking at different parks. In terms of water, we hadn't gone that far. But there might be some other kind of low-cost ways to be able to do it, you know, water catchment systems and things like this. So I don't think that should be something that limits it, but certainly something we can consider.
I think the property might be, I think you're right, I didn't even think about water catchment systems, but I think the property might be the limited area. If you look at I know that if you look at the map of the city, there's a lot of park deserts in the city. I think it's the first ward, the second ward, the third ward, even the fourth are very fortunate that we're so close to parks. But there's some other wards that there's not much available.
Yeah.
I know that the Housing Commission recently identified city property that I wasn't aware of before, but I don't know that there you would be thrilled about looking at it as a community garden versus building on it, but not all of them may be
Yeah, and I
suitable for
certainly-
building either.
Yeah, we need to think about what is buildable versus what would be good garden lots, and I think that would certainly separate the two, but I think, I don't think that would be.
Yes, some of what they're looking at with Greg, and I think Steve, was what properties do we have to hold on to? Like we need them for right of ways and stuff, or are such landlocked or something like that that they're not gonna really be usable. So I mean, that's it. If we can't, there's nothing that says we can't keep them on the rolls and do a community garden, but if something was buildable, was what they were looking at. So, and I don't think they've gotten that far yet to know which ones we absolutely have to have versus. But just a quick question, Catella Park on the other side of Lettuce Highway, does that get used for very much anymore?
Soccer
Sorry.
games, I see there frequently. Other than that,
I mean, Maple Street Park has water.
It does.
Yeah, Maple Street Park has water, and it's just basically a big grassy field with there's no playground equipment or sports fields or.
wait, where's the water in Maple Street Park?
There's a hose spigot.
Yeah, right, we come in.
So if you walk.
You're talking about at the top of Maple Street, in that park. Where in that park is there water?
You walk in the lower entrance,
Yeah,
and then you go down to the left around the bend, there's a little shed thing, I mean, it's up as high, right behind the bench.
Yeah,
The community, or the
I had no
garden
idea
club
that
uses
was,
it, because the garden club does the plantings on
I
it.
had no idea that's what was.
yeah, go up there and have a glass every once in a while.
So, we have the new OCI grants that are gonna be coming out through DO for events. But people could, they're for up to $1,000. So people could, apply to Destination Oleana for those. And they could do a gardening event where they can create a garden. But on the other hand, I also wanted to mention that when we did the upgrade to the community garden at, oh my God.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. That the most recent upgrade was, I think, in 2018, where we upgraded the fence and we upgraded the water system and we put in a handicap path and the handicapped accessible path and beds. That was $25,000 grant. And that wasn't to create the garden, that was just to enhance the garden. The shed was
Yeah.
part of that as well. So these community gardens can be expensive to get started, so we definitely need to start thinking about a budget. The grants aren't available. They haven't been available since that round, I believe, which was around 2017, 2018.
And who is that through?
That was through Ag and Markets, specifically for community gardens. The other thing to think about is some of our, quite a few of our neighborhoods in the city are in potential environmental justice areas. And our community garden would definitely be a way that you're trying to provide services for people that live in an environmental justice area. So that helps you with your grants and things like that. But I've been keeping an eye out since my last grant for this, and nothing's come through yet, so I'll continue to look.
There's a lot of land down behind the old bus garage that doesn't get used and want to be used.
Wasn't that the original community gardens? Was back down?
I don't remember, I thought they kicked around the idea once when I was growing up of a community garden, but I don't know if it ever got off the ground.
Back to the old soccer fields back there?
They couldn't use
Yeah,
our.
almost 20 years ago.
They could use those money
Is
for
when I
that.
first moved
You
here.
couldn't use state grant.
I think that the challenge with that, my
That's a
thinking,
cool
is that it's
idea.
just, it's
That's
not
what I
a
used to do at
community,
my
I
old
mean,
house.
it's a garden, but it's not in the community where people want to go. I recognize we'll have people from all around the city use it, and we'll often drive down there to use it, but, you know. Again, it was just something that came up, and I leaned over to Dave, and I kind of said, we should maybe think about this, because it is something that has been on the sustainability plan for a while. I forget what it was that jump-started the thinking, but.
The Community Garden Steering Committee, we have an annual discussion with them about the permitting process. They brought it up during their annual meeting that it was of interest to them to find a way to either expand their current garden or find some other alternative location. They had identified the one behind Fox Hospital, seeing if that could be looped into their network somehow.
That's not ours, right?
It's not, that's what, asking if it could be looped into the network
Gotcha.
somehow.
I didn't know about that one.
Yeah, on Mary Street, I think it's called. Yeah.
Girl Scout project, or is it high school?
I think it started out that way, I don't know what the current, yeah, I think it was like a silver gold bronze project, but.
Yeah, it's on Fox Hospital property where they had demolished their house years ago on the corner of Fifth. And it's sitting there behind the parking lot.
And that property is owned by the hospital.
So I don't know,
Used to be.
long-term future of that, what their
there was one on Chestnut Street, that was a private resident that opened up his backyard to that. Is that still in operation here doing that?
You mentioned,
Surprised no one called about that. Surprised no one called about that.
I think the fencing is probably the biggest cost you're gonna have, and that, my understanding through my work with the garden club at that point was, or the community garden group at that point was, that's what you hear about the most, is the critters getting into the garden, so the fence is like super important, so,
Yeah.
you know, to just open up a garden with some beds in it, unless they're raised up away from critters, it's not going to work without that fence, and that, they're expensive.
Those deer like to eat those plants, David.
we were asked to do
And
a
it's not just deer,
pricing.
it's like the rabbits and the woodchucks that will crawl under their fence, so we had to sink that fence a foot or two.
I mean, the deer are worse though. Those things will mow down.
We were asked to do pricing on expanding the existing garden, 8 beds, and the estimate's $6,000. So we did look into that.
So what does that mean exactly? Like that's the fencing, you have to
Yeah,
expand? fix it?
expand the existing fencing and then add the 8 beds.
Okay.
Um,
And raised beds is what it was?
Raised beds was what it was.
Were those all like the handicap level beds or? Is it
Yes,
just- okay.
they're all handicapped, yep.
The problem they have at Fort Wilcox doing expansion is shade. There's very little room anymore for them to get where they have full sun, so they have to like kind of manipulate who's where depending.
Provide them that map of city
Yeah.
property to consider, and let them guide the process since they're the community garden steering committee.
Would you want to restrict that to just parkland?
What's that?
Would we? I don't know.
Well, it could be undeveloped lots. It doesn't have to be parkland, it could be a lot you can't develop anything else on. But it
I
has to
just-
have access.
That's
It
what I'm
has to
saying,
have-
because there's like
it has to
easement
have parking.
issues and
There has
there's
to be parking
parking.
nearby, there has to be access, people need to get to it. If you're putting in handicapped accessible
Yeah.
raised beds, then you need handicapped accessible
Mhm.
route to get into it. And the whole thing around the raised beds need to be accessible. And then you need tools that are accessible. And, you know, so there's a whole list of things you need.
Oh, I didn't know we provided the tools.
We did
Yeah.
provide it there because, you know, they're shorter ones and they're on the end of a table, I believe, so that you can wheel up to them if you need to, if you're in a wheelchair, and
Makes
do
sense. I just
shorter
didn't realize.
tools. Because otherwise it's difficult to carry everything in, you know, if you're already struggling to get in on our paths and things.
I think we did some lawnmower too, don't we? There's a lawnmower down there too, isn't there? They mow in between the beds.
Yeah, and there's compost facilities, and there's all kinds of things that, you don't realize how expensive a community garden can be, but it added up. And our 25,000 that we didn't create a new garden, the huge garden was already there, and we just enhanced it. and
I think part of
expanded
the issue is, it's very different than starting like a community garden in an empty lot like in New York City, where I would see those years ago. And mainly because you didn't have to worry about deer or other critters getting in there. So you didn't necessarily have to fence it off, you just had to make sure there was enough dirt, you separate the areas, and there was usually an easy water source, so it's relatively inexpensive. Not that this is obviously insurmountable, just a lot more hoops to get through.
So the question where we want for resources, as Judy, as you're saying, that all took place over a number of years that we've invested in that Jewish Fort Wilcox.
Well, yeah, I mean, the community garden, when I got involved with it because of the grant, the community garden was all there. They had their beds, and I think DPW crews at that time bought the materials for the beds on the ground.
Yeah.
So that the wooden frames, and they built it for them, and I think you guys, the city provided the dirt too from somewhere.
Yeah.
That's what I
And
understand.
then they enhance it with the compost or anything. But when we went in, part of the reason why we got the grant was to make it accessible. And so then we did the raised tables and, you know, that's a whole nother set of costs that, when you
Well-
do that.
I would sort of echo what Scott was saying. My opinion is, if you're already looking for grant money, let's let the Community Garden Steering Committee and Judy lead the way here. If there's money available, then we can look to see where we could potentially expand. I think it's not gonna be an easy thing, but I think if there's any grant money available, that'll at least help us. And we can, I think, one easy way, since we have one on down in the 6th Ward, we could potentially look at the other side of the city, maybe even in Wilbur Park, a section. But identifying an area in the sun is going to be a little difficult, but, does anybody else have anything to add to this right now?
I just have one other thing. The garden group could be looking for donations. The city cannot do that, but they certainly could do that. Because I have no idea when another grant will come through. Those are just when the state has some money available and that's something they want to think about and fund. They may never do another one. So I hate to see this stop because we can't get grant money. We can maybe work on getting something in our budget and also work on the group itself, trying to find donations and do some fundraising for another one. I mean, you don't have to have a fence, but I have discovered that that's one of their biggest issues,
Yeah.
is not having.
Well, I would agree, because when we had the one down in, near Silas Lane years ago, that was the biggest issue. They put up, keep anything out, and the deer would just decimate the area, so. Looking at the time, we still have, speaking of deer management, that we haven't addressed yet today, but I don't want to cut this discussion off. If somebody has more to say about it, Scott or Mark.
This issue, no, deer management, yes.
Okay. Did you guys have a chance to review everything that the mayor gave us? Any thoughts?
So I'll put my thoughts out there.
Sure.
Hey, I'm not shy about that. So reading through all this, I mean, it's clear that all these municipalities kind of started on some type of culling program, right? And perhaps that was just the nature of what we had here. I mean, maybe there's others that did it differently. I would, I'm gonna kick the can. I would propose that this is an important issue, that the mayor put together a task force to look at this. Task force can be tasked with surveying if they feel like this is something they want to survey about this, and moving forward on all the different municipalities, and thankfully one of them offered their map of where they did the culling. I just don't know that we have the locations in the city. I mean, you said it's not an issue down in your area, which might be one of the areas where you have better opportunities. There's just not a lot of culling opportunities unless we want to be in the park. So
Maple
I
Street
still feel
Park.
like this is, what's that?
Maple Street Park.
So I just still feel like this is a bit of a challenge. Given where we are, it's a bit of a challenge. So, but I'm certainly open to a task force if they want to look at it.
Well, I looked at, I think I sent the updated report from New York State. That was from 2018. That wasn't that much different than what we'd already had. It was a little bit of an update as far as some of the techniques that they used, but ultimately what it looked like, it's the only surefire way to reduce the population is through a culling program, but then you have to have that program, it's not just a one-time thing. As far as the locations, one thing that, the safe locations in the city, that was my thought initially too, but then when I read through it a little bit more, the way they set it up, you can absolutely have it within the city limits and within parks and such, because they have them up in the tree stands, and one of the rules is to fire down, and it's typically with crossbows and such. I would agree, my thought, and I highlighted it right here, what the town of Camillus did was they set up a deer management committee to deal with this, because we've had no, I'm gonna go back, we originally said, we didn't wanna do any kind of survey, but after reading through this, I thought we need to have some kind of survey to see what people's thoughts are, and where the issues are, and how big of the issue. You're right, I think it's gonna be a ton of work. We could get completely swallowed by this problem if we allow it, but a group that's established just to deal with this would be proper, so.
Well, the other thing to look at too is how we might have to get our city attorney in, because we're gonna have to suspend some of our codes about
Yep.
weapons in the city, which I think crossbows, arrows, and firearms are part of that.
Well, I think you're right. I think that's something that we would deal with down the road. And that's what a lot of the other towns have had to do as well. And to have that kind of a hunt, you have to have a special permit through the DEC anyway.
And I mean, city staff's gonna also get busy too, because they're gonna have to register in the city that that they're allowed to do this and have some type of city permit, so when the police do show up, the police can be handed that, yes, this is our.
Well, one thing I will say, Scott, after reading through this, the number of people in these towns that have undertaken this is very, very few.
Mhm.
I think they had the 2020-2021 management plan from Camillus had 4 people. So I think the time involved with actually getting the permit set, I don't think it's going to be a lot. I think more of the work is going to be leading up to that point.